Well, good evening and welcome to Ratio Christi South Africa. It's good to have all of you joining us here this evening. We are delighted to be kickstarting our annual symposium. Typically, this event is held online, and typically this event has been held live, but as we have it shifting between the regions where we have Ratio Christi chapters, but because of the COVID restrictions this year, we're now having the event online. And whilst that's not our preferred option, we do have some benefits with that, in that we are able to pull together a outstanding panel of speakers for what is probably the strongest program we've ever had. And so in that respect, we're very grateful for this opportunity to be joined by scholars from all over the world to help us attend to a variety of questions. First of all, to those of you who are new to Ratio Christi is a student campus ministry. That exists to serve Christians on campus and professors as well, in helping them to better understand the reasons for the Christian faith, be they scientific, philosophical, or historical reasons. We have a website here in South Africa. Do take the time to check that out, ratiochristi.co.za, and also visit our YouTube channel, where we have a growing number of interviews with scholars from all over the world, in which you can subscribe to the channel if you're interested, and join our growing number of subscribers. We also would appreciate, as a campus ministry, any support in terms of prayer, financial support, but also recommendation. Feel free to recommend our resources, be there our free articles that we have on our website, to people, where we tackle all kinds of topics, or our interviews with scholars on our YouTube channel. And so please recommend those to students, high school students and university students as well, or anybody who has questions for that matter. My name is Simon Brace. I am the National Director for Ratio Christi, and also the Chapter Director at Northwest University. And it's my privilege to kickstart our online event this evening. So we are very privileged this evening to be joined by a scholar from the United States, Dr. Tim McGrew. Dr. Tim McGrew is a professor of philosophy at Western Michigan University, where he has been teaching for over 25 years. His research interests include formal epistemology, the history and philosophy of science, and the history and philosophy of religion. When he is not doing philosophy, he enjoys playing chess online, coaching at his local chess club, running trails, and making high-quality paper airplanes. He lives in Southwest Michigan with his wife, Lydia McGrew, who is also an amazing Christian scholar herself, and they have their 3 daughters. I've had the privilege of knowing Tim for a number of years. I got to work with him when I was living in the United States. We did a conference up in his part of the world, and it was a tremendous privilege to work with him. And over the years, he's been a tremendous supporter of Ratio Christi, and is, in my estimation, one of the most capable Christian apologists that I'm aware of. I encourage all of you to look at some of the work he's been doing, engaging with some of the tough-minded atheists and skeptics that are out there. His recent conversation with Graham Moppy, for example, that he did, was a terrific conversation for those of you interested in listening to the debate between Christians and atheists or skeptics. So he's done a tremendous amount of work. His stuff's on YouTube and other platforms, and I do recommend that you check him out. Now, this evening, he's not going to be addressing philosophy. We're going to be tackling another topic that's of great interest to him, which is the history of Christianity. And more specifically, we're going to be looking specifically at one book in the New Testament, and we're going to be addressing the question of the historical reliability of the book of Acts. And so, Tim, there's my introduction. It's good to have you join us this evening. Welcome to Ratio Christi South Africa.
Thank you so much, Simon. It's a real privilege to be able to speak for this conference. I've had the chance to speak with your group a few times, and so this is just like coming home online, and maybe someday we'll make it happen with an in-person visit, but this year is not that year, unfortunately. I'm about to start a slide presentation. I just want to say a word before I do. There is a great deal of detailed content in the slides. And for that reason, you may find that if you're trying to take notes, your pencil begins smoking from the speed at which you are plying it. So I have just sent all of the slides to Simon, and you are welcome to send him an email note and get the slide deck from him. So if you want this material, there it is. I welcome your sharing it and using it. This is information that wants to be free, so I claim no copyright over it. I only ask that if you're going to give the same presentation yourself, mention where you got it. That's all. All right, with that out of the way, I'm going to move to my share screen option. And here we have the thing. And so, Simon, am I in a speaker now?
Yes, we can see it. We can see the PowerPoint. You're clear to go.
All right, great. So the topic that Simon and I decided upon here was the reliability of Acts, and I want to talk to you about that. And I've chosen an epigraph for today's talk, which I think sums up the way that I want to approach this. It's from Proverbs 18. It says, "The one who states his case first seems right until the other comes and examines him." I hope by the time that we're done today, you will understand why I've chosen this as an epigraph for this talk. I want to look at the question of whether Acts, the fifth book of the New Testament, following the four Gospels, is historically reliable. And the way I want to approach that question is by weighing the positive and the negative case in the balance. If I had set my own mind to thinking up possible criticisms of the historical reliability of Acts, you might reasonably wonder whether I was doing full justice to the negative case. So instead of myself attempting to construct that case, I have tapped into the case as developed by a prominent skeptic. And the skeptic I am choosing for the negative case is Dr. Bart Ehrman, a well-known New Testament scholar, former Christian, former minister, now apostate. And on his website, his blog, Ehrman a few years ago did something interesting. He did a sort of mock debate in which he attempted to present the case on both sides regarding the historical reliability of Acts. But the interesting thing was all the arguments on the negative side that he used are things that you can find him saying in his own voice, in propria persona, as we say. And so Ehrman is presenting the case he himself finds compelling. So I've drawn these criticisms from his website, presented them in his words, so that you won't be worried that I might be soft pedaling what can be said against Acts. Here's what Ehrman has to say. As valuable as Acts may be, as an interesting story about the first years and decades of the early Christian movement, the reality is that the book of Acts is not historically reliable. Well, why not? Here are two central claims in his negative case. Number one, Luke is more interested, he says, in spinning a good yarn than he is in preserving a historically accurate narrative. And to show this, he presents us with some contrasts, some problems he sees between Luke 24 and Acts 1, and some discrepancies he sees between the three accounts of Paul's conversion in Acts chapters 9, 22, and 26. Second, whenever Acts relates an incident from Paul's life that Paul himself discusses, there are striking and irreconcilable differences. And then Ehrman cites three examples of that. We're going to touch on all of these as we go. So the negative case is going to absorb our attention because we need to see what can be said against the reliability of Acts. Is Luke spinning a good yarn? Well, here's how Ehrman puts it again. I'm quoting him directly. In Luke 24, you can read it for yourself and see. Jesus rises from the dead, on that day meets with his disciples, and then again that day, he ascends to heaven from the town of Bethany. But when you read Acts 1, written by the same author, you find that Jesus did not ascend on that day or at that place. Jesus instead spends 40 days with his disciples, proving to them that he had been raised from the dead. It's not clear why he would have to prove it, let alone do so for 40 days. And only then, 40 days after the resurrection, does he ascend. And here he ascends not from Bethany, but from Jerusalem. Luke tells the same story twice and in two radically different ways. Historical accuracy does not appear to be his major concern. End of quotation from Ehrman. Now, something that we're going to learn very, very quickly as we deal with Bart Ehrman and his assertions about Scripture is that any time he tells us that a passage of Scripture says something, the very first thing we need to do is read it for ourselves. And when we do, we will discover that quite frequently, Ehrman is misrepresenting what the passage actually says. Let's fact check him on Luke 24. Luke 24 does not say, you can read it for yourself and see, that Jesus' ascension took place on the same day as the resurrection. I invite you to take the passage and read it. What he's reacting to is the fact that there are no indicators of time in the narration of the events. This is what is called telescoping. We take a bunch of things and we simply machine gun them out. Imagine telling someone about your summer vacation. You say, well, we went hiking along this trail and we climbed a local mountain and we did whitewater rafting and we saw 2 bears. You tell all these things. Do you mean you did all of that on one day? Well, no, you don't. Did you say that it was on different days? No, you didn't say that either. Did all those events happen in exactly that order in which you narrated them? Well, actually, no, not necessarily. Does that mean you're telling a falsehood? No, they're all things that happened. So Luke is just telescoping a lot of stuff together. And frankly, we can't tell from that how long of a period of time is supposed to have been taken there. This is something that is quite common in ancient historians. You can read it in Sallust, in Lucian, in Cicero, in Quintilian. So I've given citations here. You can go and look them up and see this kind of telescoping happening in secular historians. This is not something that is unique to Luke. It's not some kind of fundamentalist special pleading that we're doing on Luke's behalf. This is very common in historical narration. How about the location of the ascension? Here's what Luke 24 says. And he led them out as far as Bethany, and lifting up his hands, he blessed them. While he blessed them, he parted from them and was carried up into heaven. So Bethany is the location. What does Acts 1:12 say? Then they returned to Jerusalem from the mount called Olivet, which is near Jerusalem, a Sabbath day's journey away. So a short distance away from Jerusalem. Notice this is after the ascension. But Ehrman just said that he ascended from Jerusalem. Here it says they returned to Jerusalem. So clearly they're outside of Jerusalem at that point. So it does not say that Jesus ascended from Jerusalem. It says they returned to Jerusalem. You have to read the text for yourself. Anytime Ehrman tells you what a Bible verse says, go read it for yourself. Here's a map of the environs of Jerusalem and Bethany. You'll see that Bethphage and Bethany are to the east around the slopes of the Mount of Olives, and that there would be a little bit of a trip that would be taken to get you into Jerusalem, and then there'd be the enclosure wall of the temple and so forth. So you can see the distance on there, maybe a couple of miles. The 1 mile indicator is down in the lower right corner. So the texts of Luke and Acts are perfectly consistent here. Bart is trying to pull one over on us. Here he is on Paul's conversion. Quote, on the 3 occasions, Acts narrates the conversion of Paul on the road to Damascus, chapters 9, 22, and 26. Compare them closely to one another, and you find very odd contradictions. Okay, let's see what those are. He lists 3. Acts 9 versus Acts 22. Do Paul's companions hear anything? Acts 9 versus Acts 26. Are Paul's companions knocked down or are they standing? Acts 9 and Acts 22 versus Acts 26. Is Paul instructed by Ananias or not? Ehrman claims all of these are contradictions. Let's have a look. All these examples, he says, simply show that Luke was far more interested in telling a gripping story than he was in being consistent. His artistic license has seriously undercut his historical accuracy. There's the claim. Where's the argument? In chapter 9, Paul's companions hear the voice of Jesus talking to Paul, but they don't see anyone. In chapter 22, they see the light, but they don't hear anything. Which is it? So let's look at the passages. Acts 9:7. The men who were traveling with him stood speechless, hearing the voice, but seeing no one. Acts 22. Now, those who were with me saw the light, but did not understand the voice of the one who was speaking to me. Notice the way that the translators here, and I usually follow the ESV when I'm giving these quotations, have rendered uk ekusan, the Greek phrase there, as not understanding. Now, akuo is the word for hearing, but can it also mean understanding? Well, let's check. Could uk ekusan be translated as they did not understand? This is how the NIV translates it. This is how the ESV translates it. This is how the NASB translates it. This is how the Net Bible translates it. This is how the King James translates it. Oh, the King James just says literally did not hear, but all the other modern translations are saying did not understand. Now, look at the way that Luke himself uses ekusen when Jesus is preaching. But I say to you who hear. Clearly, Jesus means to you who hear with understanding. That's clearly the meaning there. So evidently, the term can have that range of meaning. And so the objection really turns on a question, not of the plain meaning of the text, but of the interpretation of the text. Ehrman interprets the phrase as woodenly and as narrowly as he can, because he needs to do that to create the appearance that there's a contradiction between these two accounts. Not fair play. How about objection number 2? In chapter 9, the companions are left standing while Paul falls to the ground. In chapter 26, they are all knocked to the ground. Which is it? You know what the first thing that we have to do is here. We have to read the text for ourselves. Acts 9 says the men who were traveling with him stood speechless. Acts 26 says, and when we had all fallen to the ground, okay. So there are 3 possibilities here. Possibility number 1, the expression stood speechless is simply an idiomatic expression that means they were stopped in their tracks, not that they were standing upright the whole time. So Lightfoot's commentary on Acts says, stood speechless means they are arrested in the moment, all fell to the ground. That's the after effects there. And then he gives the Greek for they all fell to the ground. Second possibility, the expression stood speechless could be Luke's editorial voice in paraphrasing the story that he has heard. That's a very mild amount of editorial license in retelling a story. Third possibility, Paul told the story several times with minor variations of this sort, and Luke is reporting it the way that Paul told it one of those times. None of these creates any problem with Luke's accuracy as a historian. In fact, the more that we look at these possibilities, the more it looks like Ehrman is really pettifogging. He is seizing upon things to try to create an appearance of problems where there aren't any. But, you know, we ought to stop and calibrate our expectations. What does honest, firsthand testimony look like, really close up to the facts, in a non-religious context? Because Ehrman is setting up here a kind of expectation that I think we will not find borne out when we look at actual reportage as it happens in real life. So here's an example, not religious. In 1927, United States President Calvin Coolidge notified the newspapers that he would make an announcement. The reporters were admitted to his office and filed past him while he handed each a typewritten slip of paper indicating that he did not choose to run for office again. The whole process took about 1 minute. So here we have professional reporters for major newspapers. They're experienced observers. They're primed to pay particular attention to what's going to happen. And then they went out and they immediately filed their reports for their respective newspapers. What did those reports look like? Here's what they looked like. The New York Telegram actually tabulated some of these. This is amusing. Just a trace of a smile about his lips, said one reporter. Very serious and grim, said another one. He did not smile, said another. He sat looking up at them. He was standing at his low mahogany desk. Sitting or standing? Which way is it? He was standing, said another one. Oh, my word. Well, what shall we do? I think we'd better conclude that all the newspaper reports were a lie and maybe Calvin Coolidge never existed. No, nonsense. This is the sort of variation that one gets in ordinary human testimony. Learn to live with it. This is not some kind of fancy maneuver that we have to do as Christians in order to save the text. There are small variations. Notice he might have had a trace of a smile about his lips as he handed one reporter a slip and then been very serious and grim with another. He might have begun by sitting as they filed into the room and then stood to hand them the pieces of paper. We don't know, but we wouldn't consider those to be unreasonable harmonizations of these narratives. We must get over the artificial assumption that unless the narratives say the same things in the same words, they are hopelessly contradictory. That's just not the way that careful, first-hand human testimony works. Okay, having calibrated our expectations a bit, we can see that small variations in detail are common in the testimony of honest eyewitnesses, and we should not assume that this means that they're getting it wrong. After all, people don't always just stand still waiting for the next scene to come. Maybe some of the people fell to the earth when Paul saw the light and heard the voice and then stood back up. I don't know. Maybe standing or they stood still simply means that they were arrested in their journeying forward. Maybe it's an idiom. We don't know. We should not rush to the assumption that there's something wrong with the narrative because of that. How about Paul's conversion? Here's objection number 3. In chapters 9 and 22, Paul is told to go to Damascus to be instructed by a man named Ananias about what to do next. In chapter 26, Paul is not told to go to be instructed by Ananias. Instead, Jesus himself instructs him. Well, which is it? You know what we have to do, right? We have to look at the text, but these are long texts, so I'm going to just tell you the punchline. Paul doesn't say in his speech in Acts 26 that he was not told to go to be instructed by Ananias. He just doesn't mention Ananias. Luke omits that in his narration in Paul's speech. Maybe Paul omitted it too at that point. It's not an assertion of the contrary. Silence is not denial. I haven't said anything today about my wife. That doesn't mean that I don't have a wife. Silence is not denial. But Ehrman needs it to function as a contrary assertion to generate a contradiction. Otherwise, he doesn't have a problem. All these examples simply show that Luke was far more interested in telling a gripping story than he was in being consistent. His artistic license has seriously undercut his historical accuracy. No, on the contrary, these examples show that Ehrman is far more interested in impugning the historical accuracy of Acts than he is in representing the text fairly. His rhetorical excesses, if I may borrow a phrase, have seriously undercut his credibility. Okay, what about the irreconcilable differences between Acts and Paul's letters? Says Ehrman, whenever Acts relates an incident from Paul's life that Paul himself discusses, there are striking and irreconcilable differences. Every time you compare what Acts has to say about Paul with what Paul has to say about himself, you find discrepancies. And he gives us examples. Acts 17 and 1 Thessalonians 3, did Paul come to Athens alone or in the company of Timothy? Acts 9 and Galatians 1, did Paul make a beeline to Jerusalem to confer with the other apostles, Ehrman's phrase, or not? Acts 17 and Romans 1, did Paul teach that God excuses the worship of idols, or did he teach that idol worshipers are without excuse? Hey, Acts versus Paul, what are we going to say? Let's look at them. Here's what he says about, this is Ehrman now, not me, about Acts 17. Acts 17 is clear and unambiguous. When Paul traveled to bring the gospel to Athens, he came by himself without Timothy or any of the other apostles. But Paul himself is also clear and unambiguous. In 1 Thessalonians 3, we learned that he came to Athens precisely in the company of Timothy, not by himself. It couldn't be both. You just got to take Bart Ehrman's word for what the texts say, or you got to read them for yourself. By the way, I have an Inigo Montoya kind of reaction for you Princess Bride fans out there. I do not think that word means what you think it means. All right, what 1 Thessalonians 3 actually says. Verses 1 and 2. Therefore, when we could bear it no longer, we were willing to be left behind at Athens alone. And we sent Timothy, our brother and God's co-worker in the gospel of Christ, to establish and exhort you in your faith. Notice Paul does not say how he arrived in Athens. All that this passage tells us is that Timothy was with him at some point in Athens, and it suggests that Paul, whether alone or accompanied, was himself in Athens for some period of time when we could bear it no longer before he sent Timothy back. It doesn't say how he arrived. What does Acts 17 actually say? Then the brothers immediately sent Paul off on his way to sea, but Silas and Timothy remained there. Okay, Acts does say they remained there. Those who conducted Paul brought him as far as Athens, and after receiving a command for Silas and Timothy to come to him as soon as possible, they departed. So Paul sent them back and said, get Silas and Timothy out here as fast as possible. So it expressly reports that a message was sent back urging Timothy to join Paul as soon as possible. According to 1 Thessalonians 3, Timothy was in Athens shortly thereafter with Paul. So where in all of this is the contradiction? Is there a contradiction? I don't see one. There's also an undesigned coincidence, so I'll just slip over here into a little bit of the positive case, but we'll do more later. Even within Acts, there's no report of Timothy's coming to Paul in Athens in response to Paul's command. We learn later that he comes to Paul in Corinth from Macedonia. Well, that's curious. So even within Acts, there's a sequence of events narrated that leaves a gap. It's one best filled by the supposition that Timothy came to Paul in Athens and was later sent back up to Macedonia and then rejoins Paul in Corinth. But that's a supposition. If you then read 1 Thessalonians 3, you'll find that's exactly what it describes. So actually, 1 Thessalonians 3 interlocks with Paul's doings and Timothy's doings as reported in Acts and fills in ways that make good sense of them. So far from being in conflict, they're in a subtle but beautiful harmony. External contradiction number 2, when Paul himself talks about his conversion in Galatians 1, he insists that after he had his vision of Jesus, he did not. He absolutely and positively did not. He swears to it, go to confer with the other apostles in Jerusalem, not for years. And what happens when Paul converts, according to Acts 9? What is the first thing he does after he leaves Damascus? He makes a beeline to Jerusalem to confer with the other apostles. In Acts, he does precisely what he himself swears he didn't do. There's that word precisely again. What shall we do with that? Well, here's what Acts 9 actually says. When many days had passed, the Jews plotted to kill him. But their plot became known to Saul. They were watching the gates day and night in order to kill him. But his disciples took him by night and let him down through an opening in the wall, lowering him in a basket. So here's the question. How long a period of time is denoted by many days? Does it mean so few that we could say he made a beeline for Jerusalem? Well, the expression is indefinite. And in 1 Kings, we actually have a case where many days in Hebrew is immediately glossed as 3 years. Now, as the Jewish counting method would go, that would mean parts of 3 years. So somewhere between 1 and 3 years as we would reckon it, but it's still not something that means, oh, he ran right out. No, many days has an expansion of meaning that can span far enough to mean this. But doesn't it sound like Luke doesn't know how long Paul waited before he went to Jerusalem? That depends on how much you read into the text. Telescoping the narrative may be at work here once again, omitting details that are unimportant to the principal theme, because the principal theme is Paul gets commissioned to be the apostle to the Gentiles. But what if Luke was unaware of the exact span of time? So what? That's an unimportant detail. He doesn't actually say anything that contradicts what Paul says, contrary to what Ehrman claims. It hardly shows he was unfamiliar with Paul's life and mission. Ehrman is making mountains out of molehills once again. Final contradiction. In Acts 17, when Paul is preaching to the pagans of Athens, he tells them they worship idols out of ignorance. They simply don't know any better. And because of that, God overlooks their mistake. But now he gives them a chance to recognize the truth and worship him alone. That stands in sharp contrast with the view that Paul himself lays out in his letter to the Romans, where he says pagan idolatry and false worship are contrary, they're without excuse, he says. It's contrary to what he said in Acts 17, according to Ehrman. In Romans, Paul tells us pagans worship idols because they did not know that there was only one God, and they rejected that knowledge in full consciousness of what they were doing. And because of that, God has cast his wrath down upon them. Well, which is it, says Ehrman? Did they commit idolatry out of ignorance, or are they fully aware of what they're doing? So God judges them. Assuming Paul knew what his own views were, you'd have to say that Acts has misrepresented the very core of his preaching message. Let's read the text for ourselves. Paul does not tell them that they worship idols in general out of ignorance. In fact, he doesn't open to talk about idols at all. He notes their inscription on an altar to the unknown God, and notes that that reflects their ignorance of who that deity is, and he uses that as a hook to tell them about the true God. What God is willing to overlook, Acts 17, verse 30, is the times of ignorance. And since the Greeks prided themselves on knowledge, not ignorance, that was not a flattering reference. But also, the call is to repentance. You've done something wrong. You need to repent. It's not simply a call to enlightenment. So the day of judgment is set. Idols of gold or silver or stone ought not to be worshipped. What Romans actually says is that no one can claim ignorance as an excuse for his idolatry, since God's existence and nature are clearly seen in creation. Elsewhere, though, in Romans, he focuses on the forbearance of God just the way that he does in the speech on Mars Hill in Acts 17. So Romans 3:25, this was to show God's righteousness because in his divine forbearance, he had passed over former sins. So he's saying the same thing he said on Mars Hill. Additionally, on Mars Hill, he's trying to win converts. So he's not going to go out of his way needlessly to antagonize his audience, to dwell on the inexcusability of their idolatry. The focus here is on the call to repentance. So what should we say of Ehrman's negative case? In every instance, he distorts one or more of the texts he handles, claiming that it says things it does not say. There is no merit in his negative case. So what's the positive case? Ehrman has said there's no good reason to believe that Acts is historically accurate. Here are reasons against it. Okay, we've looked at his reasons against it, and they don't add up. They don't amount to anything of significance. But still, can we make a positive case? We can. The book of Acts is what I like to think of as the keystone in the arch of the New Testament. It bridges the gap between the Gospels, which tell us about the life and death and resurrection of Jesus, and the epistles, which are full of practical advice to an active church with all of its problems and its questions as it's growing and spreading throughout all of the Roman Empire. It's authenticated in multiple ways. It's authenticated by numerous points of external confirmation. I'm going to make a galloping run through some of those here in a couple of minutes. It's also authenticated by undesigned coincidences. We've just seen one of those. We'll get a couple more. It's authenticated by other kinds of internal evidence of authenticity, and I'll give you an example or two of that. And finally, it provides a natural way to authenticate the Gospels. The reason is the book of Acts, by common consent, is obviously written by the same person who wrote the Gospel that we call the Gospel according to Luke, our third Gospel. So whoever wrote the one wrote the other. We can learn something about the person who wrote the Gospel by looking at the book of Acts. And it turns out, especially for external confirmations, it's easier to test the historical reliability of the book of Acts because the action takes place across such a wide canvas. There's such a wide geographic range. Instead of being confined, as the Gospels are largely confined, to a little strip of land on the eastern rim of the Mediterranean, that little bit of Palestine between Tyre and Sidon and Gaza in the south. Rather, the book of Acts spreads out across islands in the Mediterranean Sea, around through Asia Minor, up and over through Macedonia, down into Greece, all the way to Athens, and eventually all the way over to the Italian peninsula and in Rome. So there is a much greater surface area for us to test the reliability of the book of Acts. Let's look at some of that external evidence now. Beginning with chapter 13 and the missionary journeys of Paul, the book of Acts intersects what we know about the Greco-Roman world in numerous ways. I'm going to give you just a sampling, and at the end, I'll give you a bibliography where you can go and look up more of this. This is just a small, incomplete sample of the points where the historical accuracy of Acts is confirmed by sources outside of the Bible. But before I begin, Bart Ehrman has an objection. He wants you to plug your ears at this point. He wants you to ignore all of the external evidence, an extraordinary thing for a historian or one claiming to be a historian to do. Why does he say that? Well, here in his own words, the affirmative side wants to argue the fact that Luke was knowledgeable about the first century and that, okay, well, that can easily be conceded. He says, of course he did. He lived in the first century. Naturally, he knows about it, but that has no relevance to the question of whether the narratives he sets in the first century happened the way he says they did. No amount of detailed confirmation is allowed to count in favor of the trustworthiness of the narratives because it could all just be common knowledge. Well, that's a clever way of trying to poison the affirmative case before it gets off the ground. Let's think about this objection. First, and this is a simple fact about the theory of knowledge, if getting historical details wrong is evidence against the historical trustworthiness of a book, like Acts, then getting them right is evidence for it. Evidence is a two-way street. You can't actually count it against in the one case and fail to count it for in the other. But maybe Ehrman could say it's only weak evidence. I mean, after all, Spider-Man stories mention the existence of the city, New York City, and we don't think that Spider-Man is history for that reason. So maybe the stuff in Luke is just like that. But the response is, it's not. The author of Acts doesn't just get things right. He gets hard things right. I think we have to guard ourselves against what I call the Wikipedia fallacy. And that's the fallacy of thinking that an ancient author like Luke could write a very detailed narrative just by looking up all the facts that he needs. There was no Wikipedia. This is a world without Wikipedia. You can't Google it. It's not there. There are no reference libraries. Such tiny libraries as they were might include a single shelf of books, and that would have things like the works of Homer in it, a few plays perhaps. You don't have massive encyclopedias, large sets of maps carefully drawn with details about them. You have to go and travel through these areas in order to be able to give a detailed account of them. Remember, as we go, Ehrman claims that the author of Acts was not a companion of Paul. So it's Google or bust. You either look it up on the internet or you are really out of luck. Well, let's see. Does he get hard things right? Or does he get only very vague things right? Overland routes, cities, landmarks, political boundaries. He's got the proper location of Iconium, which is in Phrygia, rather than in Lycaonia. So that's Acts 14. In Acts 15 and 16, he's got the correct order of approach from the Cilician gates. You'd go to Derbe and then to Lystra. Would you know the proper order for traveling overland to hit two cities in the middle of Asia Minor? Where would you look it up? The proper description of Philippi as a Roman colony, the identification of its seaport as Neapolis, which is attested both in manuscripts and in some evidence from coins, Acts 16, verse 12. Notice these are just scattered through the text. Overland routes, cities, landmarks, more of these. The right location of a small river near Philippi where they go out to worship. The proper locations where travelers would spend successive nights on this journey to Thessalonica. These are towns that are about 30 miles apart. Traveling along a good road, you can make about that distance if you're an experienced walker. Sea routes and landmarks. There's a natural crossing between two correctly named ports right at the beginning of Acts 13. There's a mountain, Mount Cassius, which is within sight of Cyprus. The proper port for a ship crossing from Cyprus, the proper port that returning travelers would use. This is a port along the coast. It's not a river port. It's one where you'd go to intercept a vessel that's moving its way up the coast. The place of a conspicuous sailor's landmark, Samothrace, dominated by a mountain that's nearly a mile high, Acts 16:11. The correct implication that sea travel is the most convenient way of reaching Athens from Berea. Correct. The summer winds, the Estian winds, would favor sailing in that direction, sailing southward down the Greek peninsula toward Athens. Local customs, local beliefs. There's the depiction of philosophical debate in the agora, characteristic of Athenian life. There's the proper reaction of Greek philosophers to the bodily resurrection. There's a play by Aeschylus, the Eumenides, where he sums up the Greek view on death. Once a mortal's blood has drained into the dust, the man is dead, and then there's no return, no resurrection from the dead. At that point, it's too late. The gods themselves are out of luck. The fact that the Ephesian theater was the meeting place of the city, confirmed by inscriptional evidence dating from AD 104. So I've given you the citation for the collection of Greek inscriptional materials there. Local languages, dialects, terminology. The name Lystra is unusual, but that is in fact the correct form. The Laconian language was unusual because in the Hellenized society in which Paul moved, usually the language was Koine Greek, but there they had their own special language. This is mentioned in Acts 14. The form of the name Troas. This was current in the 1st century. It's an unusual form again, and we find other forms of it, but there in Acts 16:8, we get the one that is period correct. The use of the correct Athenian slang word, spermologos, seed picker. That's what they say, oh, who is this seed picker? Basically, he's this country hayseed, as well as for the court, the Areion Pagon, the hill of Ares. The expression, the great goddess Artemis, and there are inscriptions in Ephesus that tell us about that. So when we get to Ephesus in Acts 19, we get that very phrase, which we can also find inscriptional evidence for. The term Tain Theon, that's the formal designation of the goddess, it's a feminine form. And there's the Salutarius document and others that show us that that was the way that their goddess got referred to. Terms for ethnic identity. They've got the use of a precise ethnic designation for people who are Berean. Local inscriptions attest that. A term for Asians, Greeks in Asians, Asianoi. And we find that again attested in inscriptional evidence. Local religious practices. 2 gods are associated with Lystra, and we can find that evidence for this from Lystra itself. How do you find this out if you don't live there, if you've never traveled there? The abundance of images in Athens, an altar to an unknown god, mentioned by Pausanias and Diogenes Laertius, both, neither of whom is a Christian writer. Notice Paul's reference to temples made with hands. He's speaking virtually in the shadow of the Parthenon, surrounded by other shrines of the finest classical art. Yeah, these are all temples made with hands. In Acts 19, the shrines and images of Artemis, terracotta images abound in the archaeological evidence. The locations of synagogues in Thessalonica, in Athens, in Corinth, titles of local officials, they're not all the same. The magistrates of the colony at Philippi are strategoi. There's a more general term in a few verses earlier. The term politarchs is used of magistrates in Thessalonica, but it's areopagites in the court at Athens. Gallio in Corinth is a proconsul. And by the way, we know independently when Gallio was in Corinth, so that nails down the time very, very precisely here. The grammateus, the chief executive magistrate of Ephesus, we found that in inscriptions. The title of honor, neokoros, the temple keeper, authorized by the Romans for major cities that possess an official temple of the imperial cult, the cult of the worship of the emperor. The proper term for the assizes, courts where you could go in matters of dispute, holding court under the proconsul. There are courts, you can go to them. he says, in trying to mollify the mob at Ephesus. There are numerous other points of detail involving local industries, proper nautical terminology, the voyage and shipwreck of Paul, and so forth. No wonder that A.N. Sherwin White summed up by saying, for Acts, the confirmation of historicity is overwhelming. Any attempt to reject its basic historicity, even in matters of detail, must now appear absurd. Roman historians have long taken it for granted. That's all external evidence. What about internal evidence? I've got maybe 15 minutes left to go here. We'll see what we can do with that. First, I want to show you a few undesigned coincidences. These are places where the text of Acts and some passage in one of the Pauline epistles interlock in a way unlikely to arise in mere fiction or from simple copying. And that suggests that both texts are truthful accounts. Here's one, 2 Corinthians 3. Paul, rather ticked off by some of the people in Corinth, says, are we beginning to commend ourselves again, or do we need, as some do, letters of recommendation to you or from you? Well, if we look over at Acts 18, we find when Apollos wished to cross to Achaia, and by the way, Corinth is the capital of Achaia, the brothers encouraged him and wrote to the disciples to welcome him. So Apollos came with a letter of recommendation. Paul says, look, I didn't need a letter of recommendation like some people do. Remember, people had fragmented into factions, as Paul had to address in 1 Corinthians 1. Some of you are saying, I'm a follower of Paul. Others are saying, I follow Apollos. Paul, later in that first epistle, says, I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the growth. Notice the implicit chronology here. He came first, then Apollos came, but God gets the credit for whatever happened. That suggests that Apollos came and preached at Corinth after Paul had left the city. And if you look at the timeline in Acts 18 and Acts 19, that's exactly what happened. Paul's short visit to the apostles. Galatians 1:18, Paul says, after 3 years, I went up to Jerusalem to visit Cephas and remained with him 15 days. Now, I don't know about you, but if I got a chance to hang out with St. Peter, I think I could do with well over 2 weeks. I think I would probably make a couple of years of it. So why the abortive meeting? I mean, 15 days is fine, but wasn't there anything more to say? Didn't you want to get down a complete account of what he knew about Jesus, all the things he remembered? Why such a short visit? Well, Acts 9 actually fills us in on the details of that and explains why it was so short. But he spoke and disputed against the Hellenists, that would be the Greek-speaking Jews, the Hellenized Jews, but they were seeking to kill him. And when the brothers learned this, they brought him down to Caesarea and sent him off to Tarsus. In other words, they said, Paul, we don't want you to get killed here, so it's time to leave. That's why the visit was so short. Here's a lovely one. In 1 Corinthians 4, Paul says, that is why I sent you Timothy, and it's past tense. So Timothy's already been sent. But later in that very same epistle, he says, when Timothy comes, so he expects the letter to arrive before Timothy does. So Timothy's already gone, but Paul thinks the letter's going to travel faster. We have to infer then that Timothy must have taken some indirect route to Corinth. In Acts 19:21, we see that he did take such a route, going up and around through Macedonia. Now, here I'll give you just a crude little hand-drawn map here. So Timothy's the dotted line. He's going from Ephesus to Troas, maybe crossing a little bit of water there, but going over through Macedonia, talking to the churches there, and then coming down the peninsula to Corinth in Achaia. But letters typically got sent by boat straight across the Aegean Sea. So Paul sent Timothy on his way to stop off at churches, check on things, and eventually come to Corinth. Meanwhile, he wrote this letter and sent it straight across. Of course, he expected the letter to arrive first. And that's when he expected Timothy to come and find them already in possession of the letter. And therefore, he could instruct them on how to receive Timothy when he came. Paul's ministry change, another undesigned coincidence. I love this one. Acts 18 starts out because he was of the same trade, that is tent making. He stayed with Priscilla and Aquila, and they were working, for by trade they were tent makers, and he was reasoning in the synagogue every Sabbath. Note, a Sabbath is only one day a week, and trying to persuade Jews and Greeks. But when Silas and Timothy came down from Macedonia, Paul began devoting himself completely to the word, solemnly testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Christ. Now, whatever picture you get of Paul, the one thing that you realize is this was not a guy to do anything by half measures. So this looks a little bit odd. The question is, why would he only be preaching one day a week and then suddenly go to 7 days a week? Well, here's what we find when we cross-check that with the epistles of Paul. It has something to do with the arrival of Silas and Timothy. Well, 2 Corinthians 11 says, I robbed other churches by accepting support from them in order to serve you. And when I was with you and I was in need, I did not burden anyone, for the brothers who came from Macedonia supplied my need. So I refrained and will refrain from burdening you in any way. In other words, he worked with his hands because he wasn't going to take any money from the church where he was working. When they came from Macedonia with a gift, he said, okay, that enables me to pay the bills. I'm going to preach 7 days a week. And he did, but he never asked the Corinthians for it. That money came from Macedonia. I want you to look for a minute at the three accounts of Paul's conversion. You've seen Bart Ehrman's attempt to say that there's something wrong with them, and I think that that's a pretty flimsy attempt. I want to look more carefully at them because I think there are some interesting things. In Acts 9, Luke narrates Paul's conversion. In Acts 22, he makes his defense to an unfriendly mob of Jews at the temple in Jerusalem. And in Acts 26, he makes his defense before Festus and Agrippa. So the question is, do the variations in the accounts fit these very different conditions? Well, Acts 9 is narrated by Luke. As the narrator, Luke notes the medical details of the restoration of Paul's sight by Ananias, that he was blind and he put his hands over his eyes and prayed, and that there fell, as it were, scales from his eyes. Who's Luke? What does Colossians 4:14 tell us about Luke? Oh, he's the beloved physician. He's exactly the person we would expect to be looking at medical details and to care about those details. Those details don't come up at either of the occasions where Paul is making his own defense before either of those audiences. Move to Acts 22. Paul, having been pulled away from the mob by a group of Roman soldiers, is pausing on the steps above the mob, and he addresses them in ways that are calculated to appeal to the Jews. He speaks in Aramaic. He calls his listeners brothers and fathers. He explains that he was raised in Jerusalem, trained under Gamaliel. He speaks of the law of our ancestors very respectfully. He says he was as zealous for God as any of you are today. When he describes Ananias, he calls him a devout observer of the law and highly respected by all the Jews living there. And he delays as long as it's possible using the word Gentiles. And then when he does, the riot breaks out again. That's Paul speaking to Jews in Acts 22. What happens when he speaks to the Gentiles? Here, there's no fear of sudden interruption or an outbreak of violence, so he has time to develop more doctrine. He draws a sharp contrast between himself and the Jews. The Jews are his accusers and adversaries. He calls the Christians in Damascus saints. He says he tried to force them to blaspheme. He doesn't mention Ananias at all. His references to his own mission to the Gentiles are obvious. They're not at all disguised or delayed. He does it again and again and again. And he mentions that the voice on the road to Damascus spoke to him in Aramaic. He doesn't have to say that to the Jews. He's already speaking to them in Aramaic. They assume that that's the language in which the voice would speak to him. In each of these ways, the different accounts of Paul's conversion give us a very apt picture of who's telling it, the circumstances they're telling it, the interest those people would have, the interest the audience would have, the things you would have to do rhetorically to tell those stories. How do we move from Acts to the Gospels? Well, Luke and Acts come from the same writer, and there's good evidence from the we passages that begin in Acts chapter 16 that the author was a companion of Paul. If the book of Acts comes from a meticulous historian who seems to have firsthand knowledge of at least some of the life and doings of Paul, this fact should increase the credibility of Luke. But there's more. First, each gospel, including the Gospel of Luke, ends with the empty tomb and or the resurrection. And that's a central theme in Acts all through it. Acts 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10, 13, 17. You can't put your finger down on an early chapter of Acts without being within an inch of the resurrection. Also, it's a theme in the epistles, Romans, Corinthians, Galatians. There's also implicit unity. Notice this. In Acts, we're constantly told about baptism. It's everywhere practiced and presupposed. But in the Gospel of Luke, there's nothing either about Jesus baptizing or about Jesus' institution of baptism. We get that from the other Gospels and most strikingly from Matthew. And yet, it's all interconnected. The Christian community practices the breaking of bread as a memorial for the death of Christ, but he was killed as a criminal. This isn't just consistent with Jesus' reported command in Luke 22 to do this in remembrance of him. It's incomprehensible unless what was a shameful criminal death was somehow transformed. And of course, we know from the Gospels what the Christians claimed that transformation was. In fact, it's so striking, I can't help quote from one of our time's top theologians, Richard Dawkins. In The God Delusion, he says, "It is, when you think about it, remarkable that a religion should adopt an instrument of torture and execution as its sacred symbol, often worn about the neck. Lenny Bruce rightly quipped that if Jesus had been killed 20 years ago, Catholic schoolchildren would be wearing little electric chairs around their necks instead of crosses." Just so, Mr. Dawkins. You are exactly right. I have a Sherlock Holmes reaction to this. What seems strange to you is only so because you do not follow my train of thought or observe the small facts upon which large inferences may depend. To sum up, the evidential significance of Acts, the historical accuracy of the book of Acts is fantastically well supported by evidence of all kinds. Historical, geographical details verified by secular documents, archaeology, coins, cartography, internal interconnections with multiple epistles of Paul, realistic variation in the manner in which the same story is told to different audiences. And it affords significant support to the Gospels by demonstrating Luke's reliability as a historian, by presupposing material from other Gospels not found in Luke, by emphasizing the widespread observance of the Lord's Supper, which can be explained only by something like the resurrection. If you would like some further study, here are some resources. Again, I won't bother to leave the slide up for very long because Simon's got all the slides, including this one. But here are some books. I will just mention that the John Saul Howson, the Stanley Leeds, the William Paley, and the James Smith are all things that you can access on the Library of Historical Apologetics. That's historicalapologetics.org. So those books are all free. But for the other books, you'll have to shell out and find a way to justify your purchase of something. With that said, I'm going to stop sharing. Coming back now, Simon, you're still with us. Great. Okay, I'm back in propria persona. Simon, you're muted. There you go.
Yes. There we go. Can you hear me?
I can.
Yes. Well, thank you very much for that excellent presentation. And I suspect that there's a lot more there that we could unpack as well on the Book of Acts. I've was introduced to Colin Hemmer's work by Dr. Geisler when he was still teaching, and I've read portions of it, but I certainly wouldn't mind getting my hands on Colin Hemmer. I don't know if it's readily available, but I would love to.
My wife and I prevailed upon the publishers to reprint it. So it has been reprinted. It was out of print, but we got them to bring it back into circulation, and you can buy it on Amazon now. Brilliant. Well, that's useful then. Well, we're going to dive into some questions from this now.
recently did a study in the Book of Acts with one of our students, but what I was wanting to try and do is just to show you, maybe you can help us connect the case you've made, for example, with the Book of Acts, with some of the other the New Testament documents, and show how there might be a connection. And maybe we can start off with the question of dating, for example. You mentioned Gallio, who is a key person. Just revisit that question, and I'd like to see how you might connect it with, say, for example, Luke chapter 3, in the beginning first few verses of Luke chapter 3, where it says in the 15th year. Show us how that kind of works together.
Right. So we have a chronology of the first century from the Roman side in terms of the years of the reign of certain emperors. So the Emperor Augustus was the great emperor at the time of the birth of Christ. And he was, in his old age, he had adopted Tiberius, and he made his adoptive son co-regent with him. And then when Augustus died, I believe it was in the year 14, Tiberius became the sole emperor. And so when something happens in a certain year of Tiberius Caesar, like in the 15th year of Tiberius Caesar, as Luke says at the beginning of the 3rd chapter of his gospel, we can go back and we can say, well, if he began to reign alone in the year 12, alone in the year 14, but was co-emperor in the year 12, then that's got to start from one or the other of those. So we run that up to either about the year 27 or about the year 29. And so we can sort of tag in chronologies like that. Gallio, who was, I believe, the younger brother of Seneca, was known to be a proconsul in Corinth at the time that fits the narrative in Acts. So there's nothing unusual about saying that Paul was pulled up before Gallio. But that time span, he was there only a very short time. I believe it's Tacitus, the Roman historian, who gives us just about a half-year period of time during which Gallio was there. And so it's like the end of 51 through the middle of 52, roughly. And then he leaves, he's called away. And so it's right in that window of time, nailed down by a reference in Roman history, that Paul was there. So that allows us to be really rather precise about the dating of that particular bit of Paul's travels. When was he in Corinth? What was it in that narrow window of time when Gallio was there? So there's that kind of nice chronological tie-in there. And there are a number of others. Some of these are pretty detailed. I don't have a comprehensive list of them in my head, unfortunately.
Okay, excellent. Because I know that that's a big discussion when you're doing New Testament studies, is the dating of the New Testament documents. And so the critics will often want to date the documents much later.
Yeah, I'm actually very impressed by an argument that Adolf Harnack made back more than a century ago in a book called the Date of Acts and the Synoptic Gospels. Harnack had previously taken the view that all of the Synoptic Gospels were written after the fall of Jerusalem because they report Jesus' prophecy of the fall of Jerusalem. And the idea is, well, prophecy can't actually really occur because no miracles, and prophecy would be a miracle. Therefore, they must have been written after the event. Book of Acts is clearly written after Luke. Therefore, it must have been written after the fall of Jerusalem as well. And he goes back and argues that actually it looks like the book of Acts was written before the fall of Jerusalem. And since the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, must have been written before Acts, or at least he thinks Mark must have been written before Luke, so that puts at least two of them back there. He says, really, there is no solid reason for thinking that. I used to think that, but actually now I think they were all written back earlier than earlier even than the fire of Rome and Nero's attempt to pin the fire of Rome on the Christians, as we learn from Tacitus' Annals, book 15, chapter 44. So Harnack, himself an anti-supernaturalist, not by any means a conservative scholar, who had held the view that the Synoptic Gospels were all written after the year 70, came back, revisited it, and said, I don't even find my own earlier reasoning convincing. And so he pushes it all back to a date in the early 60s at the very latest, and possibly even late 50s for some of the synoptic gospels. I find that intriguing, and I think he actually makes an interesting case. He may well be right.
Excellent. No, that's very helpful. Another question here. We've got one. There's a question. Well, let me just start with this one then. You mentioned some of these historical writings. I've recently begun to broaden my reading in ancient history as well, and I've been attempting to read Josephus, although there's a massive amount of stuff he wrote.
Yes.
But perhaps you can also just comment on the relationship between some of the accounts, between things that you think this syncretism or a relationship between, say, Josephus's works and the Book of Acts. So, for example, the account I find quite interesting is the death of Herod Antipas. The account in the New Testament is fairly brief; it's just 3 or 4 verses, and yet there's quite a rich account in Josephus. So maybe just talk a bit about the relationship between, say, Josephus and the New Testament documents.
Right. Josephus is a Jewish historian who was born about the time of Paul's conversion, in the first few years after the crucifixion of Christ. So he was a young man in the 50s. He was from a priestly house. He had a great education. He actually became a governor in Galilee. And when the Jewish revolt broke out, Josephus, who was a Pharisee, found himself in quite a pickle, because he really did not relish war with Rome. He realized that this was not a long-term winning proposition. Rome did not rule by having its armies garrisoned everywhere. Instead, it ruled by threat. And the threat was, if you don't obey us, we will send in the legions. And when the legions come, they're going to just tear you apart. So the Jewish revolt that started in the 60s started, as Josephus is very careful to say, with zealots, not Pharisees. So he's protective of his own class. But in the course of telling the history of his people and the events leading up to that revolt, he talks about many people that we find in the New Testament. He talks about John the Baptist. He talks about Herod Antipas. He talks about Archelaus and Herod the Great. And everything that he says in his accounts really matches well what we have there, even down to little details like there's a reference in Acts 12 that at that time Herod the king, it says, stretched out his hand to trouble the church. Well, Herod the Great had been a king, but after his time, his son had been sort of pretending to be king, sitting in the kingship without the official title, Archelaus, and then he got deposed, and the whole area was ruled by Roman procurators who were subject to the governor of Syria. But you might think that's an error, but actually from Josephus we learn that near the end of his reign, Herod, the second Herod, there's a whole succession of them, but he was Herod's grandson, I believe, was given the title of king and indeed restored to the full sweep of his predecessor's kingdom. And then he dies. And the description of his death that's given in the Book of Acts is actually pretty close to the description given in Josephus. They don't seem to be borrowed from one another. Josephus mentioned something that's not found in Acts, which is that someone spotted an owl sitting overlooking the place where Herod was giving his great presentation and vaunting himself. And at that point, he's struck ill, and the owl is supposed to be some kind of omen. The Christian writers aren't interested in omens like that. They've got a different explanation for what he's done wrong. The troubles that came upon Herod Antipas, which Josephus describes, they were ascribed to the way that he treated John the Baptist. But in the New Testament, we have the account of his having John the Baptist killed. Josephus, writing as someone with a view to political and military issues, says that Herod Antipas was afraid that John the Baptist might raise popular sentiment and lead a revolution. The Christian writers, who seem to have had inside knowledge of what was going on there, say it's because John the Baptist preached that Herod Antipas had no right to be married to his current wife because she had been his brother's wife. And he had divorced his wife and she had divorced her husband, and they got together. And so that was sort of the thing that aroused then her anger. And then famously at the banquet, she asked for John the Baptist's head. So there's this interesting interplay where you see the same characters from slightly different vantage points. You see Josephus, who's very interested in any events that have military significance that might set things up for the way that we're going to go later. He's very concerned with that. And the writers of the New Testament really aren't so interested in the military significance. And so you get these different angles on things, but they really fit together rather remarkably well.
Yes. So it's good. I've really enjoyed going through Josephus and seeing those connections and the characters, the same characters cropping up at the same time as these events, which I think lends tremendous credibility to the historical reliability of the Book of Acts, for example.
Right. I think Felix is mentioned as the Roman governor who first has Paul imprisoned, and he keeps Paul imprisoned for a long time, hoping that Paul will offer him a bribe.
Yes.
And the character of Felix, as we find him in Josephus, is that he's constantly taking bribes. This is a man who's just on the take constantly. And so even though the Book of Acts doesn't attempt to give us a general character of him, that little one line is so in line with what we know about his character from Josephus.
Yes, that's interesting. It's kind of a little undesigned coincidence there that we could make a relationship between that. We've got a number of questions rolling in now. The first one is Richard Purvo seems to be the main opposition in this field. Have you read his work, and if so, your thoughts on Richard?
I have. Purvo is now deceased, was a New Testament scholar who attempted to say that the Book of Acts is more akin to a historical novel than it is to a piece of history. And I have two problems with that. The first is that he really does not deal in any detail with the massive level of historical confirmation that we have for the Book of Acts, which is just bears absolutely no comparison to something like the Greek novel Kaleroe, Karatan's novel Kaleroe, which is frankly a soap opera from the beginning to the end. It hasn't got anything like this kind of detail. It just doesn't even read realistically. This novel opens with a naturally beautiful Kaleroe going to the temple of Aphrodite, and she accidentally collides headlong with a buff frat boy who is returning from the gym, and they fall in love. And this is not history. It's not even pretending to be history. It just doesn't read like that at all. So I think Purvo has just picked up the wrong end of the stick there. There is really no comparison. He hasn't really thought out the question of the details of the narrative and even the way that the same story gets told at different times. So yeah, I've read Purvo's book. I read that more than a decade ago, actually, and I just was not impressed by that. You can always put a couple of pages of Greek up and then flummox people who don't read Greek. But when you do read Greek and you go into it and you look at what he's saying, there's really no substance to the argument. So I was not impressed by Purvo's work. I realize it's the go-to work for a lot of these people, but that's just because it is saying things they very much want to hear said. And I don't think that the argument holds up.
Okay. Another question. Could you clarify for us what a contradiction truly entails? There is a lot of equivocation and confusion regarding the term when speaking about alleged contradictions.
Right. I think a contradiction, strictly speaking, is a set of claims which it is logically impossible should all be true. Usually two claims that are said to contradict one another when it is not possible for them both to be true. A little bit more broadly, a contradiction is a pair or set of claims where it's extremely implausible that they are all true. It would require a lot of really strange things to happen for them all to manage to be true. A contradiction is not the saying of something in one passage and the omission of it in another. Omission is not contradiction. And the argument from silence is unfortunately very prevalent in many people's work, and this would include Purvo. They take silence to indicate disagreement. So if there is a story in which there's a second blind man healed in one gospel, but we find only one blind man mentioned in another, it's said to be a contradiction. Well, the other gospel doesn't say there were no other blind men. It just talks about one of them. So this idea that omission constitutes contradiction is, I think, a fundamentally bad move. And it's part and parcel of the argument from silence. And the older and warier we become about this, the more we should say silence is generally the weakest of all historical arguments. So I think a full 50% of the things that are claimed to be contradictions among the Gospels really arise from the fact that some record omits mention of a certain fact and another record has it. That is not a contradiction. If I say Matthew was not present at this event and somebody else says, yes, he was, you're wrong. Okay, now we have a problem. But what if I say I saw Matthew at the event and someone else says, oh, I saw Matthew that evening 5 miles away? Well, how long did the event go on? Maybe he was at the event early, I saw him there, and then he left. People do leave. People get up and move from place to place. Again, a lot of things that are called contradictions arise from our over-reading the text and treating it as though it says more than it's actually saying. So we do have to be quite careful there.
So then just a word of encouragement to Christians then is that when we are dealing with scriptures, we need to read it carefully, and not and also when we're dealing with skeptics is get them to look at the passage and be careful in our reading the passages as you suggested. Right, let me just sorry, I've lost my here's another one. How does our lack of original manuscripts affect the arguments for and against historical reliability?
Hardly at all. We don't have original manuscripts for much of anything from that era. The way that we get records is that manuscripts were copied and copies were made of the copies and copies were made of the copies of the copies. And we can collect a great number of manuscripts and compare them. When we do, we discover that ancient Greek copyists apparently couldn't spell any better than my students can today. So there are spelling errors, those are numerous. We find that occasionally the copyists skip a line, a little parablepsis, as they call it, in textual criticism. But that's just a human failure in copying. And if we have many copies, we can usually figure out where that line was, what was skipped, maybe even why it was skipped, maybe because you had 2 lines that began with the same word, and the eye just slipped down to the second of those and missed the first. So there are numerous manuscripts of the New Testament. There we have among the manuscripts and manuscript fragments, we've got thousands of these, and it far outstrips what we have from any other writing of antiquity. That does mean that there are a lot of variants, most of them completely trivial. Imagine that someone writes a sentence about Herod. One person writes King Herod and spells it Herod. Somebody else, listening to you say the same sentence and writing it down, says King Herod and spells it with 2 R's. Oh, there's a variant. Somebody else says Herod the King and spells it with 1 R, but then instead of saying King Herod, says Herod the King. Oh, that's another couple of variants there, because now the word king comes after Herod. We have the extra word the in there. The vast majority of the textual variations among our manuscripts are at that level. In fact, most of them are impossible even to translate because they're just spelling variants from an era when there was no standardization of spelling. So they're just there's not really any trouble at all. We are not in doubt about 99.8% of the manuscript. There are, in the book of Acts, there is one verse I can think of offhand that comes at the end of the scene with Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch, where there's a little bit of textual doubt about one part of one verse. It's just not a big deal. And anybody who tries to blow that up and make it into a huge problem is really blowing smoke. This is, unless you have the excuse of suffering from severe obsessive compulsive disorder, you should not be thrown by this.
Okay. I know that topic of textual criticism is of particular interest to Nell, my wife, and so we should get you and her to discuss that one evening. That's another very good topic we need to tackle. Here's one on undesigned coincidences. It says, concerning undesigned coincidences, how many of them does one have to encounter to reach a high probability of historical reliability? I know that your wife has done much work on this. She's published a book on Hidden from Plain View. Maybe just talk about how that factors into the question of the integrity of the Bible.
Right. So what I want to say is, this is a question best answered by an individual's just going and starting to look at some of them. There are so many. I think in between Acts and the first 4 Pauline epistles, there are more than 36 such interconnections, maybe even more like 46, and they just keep on going. I've drawn some with 1 Corinthians and Acts, and you can find many, many others. Lydia's book, Hidden in Plain View, covers only a subset, only a small selection of what could be done. William Paley's book, Horai Paul and I, is the book. Don't worry, the book itself is not in Latin, just the title, The Times of Paul. But the book covers numerous undesigned coincidences. When you begin to go into it and you actually appreciate the weight of them and the fact that the more casual the reference is, to say one passage casually drops a fact that explains something in another passage or in another book, the more you will feel their force. And I don't think there's really a lot of value to trying to say, oh, you should need exactly 16 of them before you're this confident. Look at them, feel their force. You will come. I would predict that if you're a reasonable person, you will come long before you've reached the end of the list to a point where you say, okay, I don't even need any more evidence. This is pretty overwhelming stuff. And then they just keep coming and coming and coming. It's truly a wonderful source of argumentation. And it's the sort of thing that we don't expect unless both of the authors are close up to the facts and habitually truthful.
Okay.
One of them might be a coincidence. 2 of them, I guess you could try to say it. 3, 4, you're stretching it. 7, 8, 12, 20. At a certain point, it's like fitting together pieces from a jigsaw puzzle. At first, when they're all tumbled out on the table and half of them are upside down, you may not even be sure they're all from the same puzzle. How many of them do I need to fit together for you to say, okay, yeah, you're assembling a puzzle here. They really do belong together. Do I have to have, part of the puppy's nose and his eye and half of an ear? How many of them do I have to snap together before you say, I admit it, there's a picture, this was all one puzzle, right? At a certain point, it just becomes unreasonable to be skeptical. And we don't have to put a number on it to see that.
Yeah, I like that analogy. That's quite helpful to picture it. Yeah. And I encourage everybody to check out your wife's book, Hidden in Plain View, which she published. I think it was 2 years ago, if my memory serves me correct.
Even longer. It's 4 years now. It's been a long time. 2017.
Gosh, time rushes on.
Yes, it does.
What do you make of the claims that Christians added to the account given by Josephus to prove the existence of Jesus Christ? I've heard this discussed before.
So you're talking about the Testimonium Flavianum from Josephus Antiquities, book 18. I suspect that Christians did add some phrases in, making it more in line with what they believed in copies that we now possess. I incline to the view that there was an original passage written by Josephus. Not everyone agrees. My good friend Jonathan McClatchy is more doubtful about this. But I think that there probably was an original passage written that was more stripped down, more like what we find in Michael the Syrian or the text of Agapius, although those may themselves have been taken from an earlier manuscript that had a Christian hand in it, but just without the interpolations. But, you know, even before any of that came to light, Louis Feldman, the Jewish Josephus scholar, the great middle of the 20th century Josephus scholar, surveyed the evidence that he had and said, you know, I suspect that the original of Josephus read something like this. And he just put it together and took out the Christian interpolations, and it reads quite smoothly. And I think that case remains, even if you have doubts about Shlomo Pine's reconstruction from the Agapian text of what may have been the original. I mean, it might be, but that we don't need that. So all that being said, our best evidence for the life and character and ministry and doings of Jesus remains by far the Gospels. They're intimate portraits, they're up close, they're far more detailed, and they interlock with one another in ways that I think, including many undesigned coincidences, which Lydia's book details, that I think should leave us in no doubt that we have here really close-up records of people who were close to the facts and knew him, or knew those who knew him, and are reporting of things that we can trust. This is a highly reliable set of documents.
Okay. I have a question coming from my side here. We have a very accomplished a Ratio Christi supporter, and she attends Dr. Louise Mabille, who was one of the co-editors of Dr. Hengstook on the book that recently came out, The Morality Wars. And so she's kind of introduced me to a lot more of the continental philosophy that's around. And she brought to my attention for the first time a term of the hermeneutics of suspicion. As a philosopher, I wanted to ask you about this, because it seems though, although that term is never thrown out there, I found that when you're engaging people, whenever people approach these texts, they kind of are doing this hermeneutics of suspicion kind of thing, where you kind of like, so maybe with your philosophy background now, maybe you could just talk a bit just about this issue of this kind of skepticism, which kind of just, you know, it's just a part of a lot of the ways that people just approach these texts. Well, they had an agenda, this kind of thing. Maybe you could just comment on that, because I think that's a big issue when you're dealing with some of these the scriptures, you know?
Yeah, I mean, when you try to say the gospel writers had an agenda, I want to say, tell me what you mean by that. The term agenda can be a loaded term, right? Does a physics textbook author have an agenda to teach you physics? Is that an agenda in some invidious sense in which we should not trust him now because we know that he means for you to believe what he says about physics? No, I mean, that's crazy. That he has a purpose for writing it, but to call it an agenda is already to sort of stack the deck, right? I would say, let's take the Gospel of Mark, often thought to have been the first of the Gospels set down, at least in Greek, and ask, does this look like a propaganda document? Well, let's see. What does it say? How does it describe the disciples who are now the leaders in the church while this is circulating? Well, they're stupid, they're cowardly, they're incompetent, they're impertinent, and they're absent without leave on the morning of the resurrection. They're boastful. This is not the way that you write a propaganda document. You don't do that. You want people to respect these leaders. You do not want them to look like bumbling idiots, which frankly, they do. Jesus works a miracle, and the next moment they're doubting his power. Jesus sends them out to cast out demons, and they bring him somebody and they say, this boy's got a devil and we can't do it. We can't cast him out. Peter boasts, even if they all fall away from you. I will not fall away, right? Mark 14. And what do we find at the end of Mark 14? They all forsook him and fled, Peter included. Now, this is not a propaganda document. And the more we actually read the text and stop sort of hovering around at the level of the chattering, nattering people who tell us what we ought to think it says, and just read it for ourselves, the more we vividly realize, this is not a document designed to put the leaders of the early church in a good light. Yeah. So I think that basically the Gospel of Mark tries about as hard as it's possible to do to go in exactly the opposite direction from saying, this wonderful church founded by Jesus with these disciples who are carrying on, who understood what he said. No, actually, Mark says they frequently did not understand what he said. Like over and over again, Mark 8, Mark 9, Mark 10, he says, the Son of Man must go to Jerusalem and be crucified. What's he talking about? They don't get it. So yeah, I think that this hermeneutics of suspicion, to get back to the phrase, that says, we have to interrogate this text and find out what was really going on, sort of torture it until it coughs up its secrets. I think that's actually a perverse way to approach the text. Do we have to say, as we approach the text, I commit to saying I'll believe everything in it before I read it? No, we do not need to say that. Yeah. We read it as we would read other historical texts. We may have our questions about this or that bit of it, but actually it hangs together remarkably well, and it's connected in some cases internally, in some cases via the book of Acts and its connection to the Gospels, with a vast body of evidence that ought in any area that wasn't religious to leave us with no doubt whatsoever that we're dealing with something highly trustworthy. C.S. Lewis says in one of his essays that this is like something that's very close up to the facts, nearly as close as Boswell was to Johnson. And I think that's right.
Excellent. No, that's good. That's very handy. We're kind of wrapping up now. So final closing question, then I'm going to ask you to do this for us, because in your discussion, you were a great discussion with Graham Oppy, which I would encourage people to go and listen to. You talked about the cumulative case. So just from your side as a Christian, how does this fit together now in terms of the reasons for why you follow Jesus and you believe in the gospel? Maybe you could just the aspect, this dimension of the scriptures, just bring that together for us then with some of the other stuff that you find compelling as to why Christianity is true and why we ought to believe it. So maybe if you could just close on that for us.
Large topic. The older I get and the more of human life and human nature I see, and the more I introspect and I think about my own life and its trajectory, the more convinced I am that Christianity offers the correct diagnosis for what is wrong with the human condition and the only possible remedy for it. That would not be enough for me to say that the remedy is true. Maybe some skeptical philosopher could say there's no remedy. We're just hopelessly lost. But Christianity, it's Christianity or nothing. And then, fortunately, Christianity is supported by this superabundance of evidence, internal evidence, external evidence, evidence of various kinds, evidence from Christian sources, from non-Christian sources. It's really an astonishing array of evidence. Many good Christians never have a doubt or a question about their faith. Bless their souls. That's wonderful. But some of us are not wired that way. And some of us are not perpetually happy. We're not perpetually moved in our heart to find the existence and the goodness of God just so obvious to us. And so it is important for us to have an anchor for those times when the feelings go away, when you do not feel like God loves you. And again, to paraphrase Lewis, you're forced to stand and look about a world from which all trace of God's hand seems to have been removed, and still obey him. And the reason that we're able to do that without intellectual dishonesty is that we know that he has not left himself without witness. So I would encourage every Christian, not just those who want to become scholars, but every Christian to study these evidences carefully. Read them, read the opposing case, talk with those who have studied them before you. Don't try to do it alone, but come to the point where you have a satisfied mind, because someday, in some dark night of the soul, the evidence is what you will have left. And God is good, and he has given that to us, and he's given us more than we need. And that is an anchor that holds.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Tim, for that closing response there. And like I said to you, thank you for your time. And we really appreciate it, all the work that you're doing in the US as a churchman and as a father and as a professor. You're an inspiration to many of us. Please continue to inspire young people and Christians to make a defense for the faith and to proclaim the gospel. And send my love to your girls. And I've sent you many emails, but as soon as the day opens up, we would love to have you and your wife and the girls, because I know your girls also have been doing some amazing work as well. You can all come over to Africa, and we'd love to just have a big McGrew conference and have you all of you come and speak. It would be wonderful. We'd love to have you visit us.
Sounds beautiful.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much, Tim. Take care and have a good day.
Thank you, Simon.